All right, I think people have started to trickle in, so we can probably get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from, and welcome to this special edition and special conversation that we are hosting at the Middle East Institute as part of the Lebanon program. My name is Christophe Abi-Nassif. I direct the Lebanon program here at the Middle East Institute, and it's a real pleasure and honor to welcome both Tamirace Fakhoury and John Nagle, with which we will be discussing their latest work, Resisting Sectarianism, Queer Activism in Postwar Lebanon. Just a word on John and Tamirace before we get started. So John is the professor of sociology at Queen's University in Belfast and a fellow at CPAD, which stands for Sectarianism, Proxies, and Desectarianization, in of itself a project hosted at Lancaster University. His research examines the relationship between social movement activism and power sharing in the aftermath of political violence. And then Dr. Tamirace Fakhoury is Associate Professor of Political Science at Aalborg University in Copenhagen. She's also the Scientific Advisor to the Middle East Chair at Sciences Po in Paris. And her core research and publication areas are power sharing and ethno-sectarian conflicts, social movements and contentious politics in the Middle East, migration and refugee politics in conflict areas, and the EU's external migration policy. So we're very fortunate to have both of them join us today. We have the next 55 minutes to discuss their latest work, to discuss the big themes, the big open-ended questions that are there, and then try to bring as many of a few into the conversation as well, having either read the book, if you'd like to discuss some particular aspects of it with John and Tamirace, or just broadly speaking, if you're interested in that subject, which in my personal experience, at least, is not incredibly covered in the context of the Middle East and Lebanon per se. So with that said, please feel free to ask any questions along the way. You have access to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And then if at any point during the conversation you have any issues, technical or not, or if you are joining us on the YouTube streaming, you can also email events@mei.edu to either ask your question there or to just channel any concerns or any technical problems we have, and then our team will be channeling these to John, to Tamirace, and to myself. With that, we're going to try to maximize kind of the conversation time that we have, because there's a lot of grounds to cover. And I will start potentially by fielding a general question to both of you, John and Tamirace, to kind of ground us or ground this conversation that we're having and kind of bring everyone up to speed. It's a pretty broad conversation, so please feel free to take it in any way you want in that space. But I was curious, since this is obviously the Middle East Institute covering kind of the relationships between the US and the region, but also trying to bring kind of these conversations, these stories from both areas into conversation. I was curious if we can start with a current overview of the current state of the rights, etc., of what is, and this is one of the things I learned by reading the book, of sexual minorities, which could in of itself be a debated term, but just trying to bring us into the picture and going over the current states, the challenges of queer movements, broadly speaking, broadly defined in the Middle East itself, before we kind of start zoning into Lebanon in a second as well.
Great, thanks, Chris, and thanks for the invite. Tamirace, shall I begin on this one?
Yes, please do, John.
Great, yeah, it's a really kind of great question. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on LGBTQ rights in the Middle East, but I think it's important, to say that most states in the Middle East have laws that criminalize sex against the order of nature, and I think there's an assumption in the West that these laws and kind of negative attitudes against queer peoples are a result of social conservatism and, a general lack of modernity in the region. But, I don't think this is necessarily the case. The historical record shows that the region, just like any other region around the world, has always been a rich kind of site of sexual diversity. So I think to kind of understand the present situation, we need to understand, a bit of history, and, what's important to really emphasize at this point is that the imposition of homophobic laws and penal codes in the Middle East were actually often done by colonial administrations, especially the French and the British. And I think you could actually argue that, these colonial administrations in many ways exported homophobia to the region. So, I mean, this kind of brings us to today, and, you know, many regimes, I think, ironically, frame same-sex relations, you know, homosexuality as foreign vices exported by the decadent West, and LGBTQ people are thus seen as pollutants and representative of a threat of moral decay. And, you know, within this framework, LGBTQ rights in particular are made out to be, you know, forms of Western sexual imperialism. And, you know, through this, LGBTQ people have been rendered into security threats for the nation, which has legitimized in many places the use of violence against them. So for repressive regimes, in particular, clamping down on LGBTQ rights acts as a signal to the wider population of the leadership's, you know, kind of willingness to crack down on political and civil liberties. And, you know, Hillary Clinton famously said a few years ago that LGBTQ rights was the fastest growing movement in history. But in actual fact, we're currently actually seeing a reversal of LGBTQ rights in many places around the world. And the Middle East, I suppose you could say, is, you know, it's part of this kind of trajectory at the moment in which rights are under pressure. There's a backlash against LGBTQ rights, which can be seen in places like Russia, Poland, Hungary, and elsewhere. And I just kind of finally add, what we need to also understand is an intersectional analysis in the Middle East and other places to understand why some forms of sexuality and gender are targeted. And, you know, it's often the case that people who are deemed to kind of transgress gender norms, especially masculinity, such as trans people, working class, queer people, and refugees, are those who are often kind of targeted by these regimes. And, you know, wealthy and middle class people, to some extent, are less likely to be targeted, and can even, you know, carve out some form of autonomy within these states. So, you know, it's not the case that these places are uniformly homophobic. You know, we need to understand both kind of history and the present and use this intersectional analysis.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the Middle East Institute for organizing this book talk. I'm really thrilled to be here. So just to add briefly to what John said, and to ground this book in a broader conversation, I just wanted to add and perhaps to emphasize that as we were writing this book, it occurred to me that the story of how queer voices in Lebanon resist the politics of sectarianism conveys a broader story. Right, and the story is really about the disciplining power of governance, the disciplining power of political systems, and the instrumentalization of people's rights more generally, but also through the various ways through which governance intersects with vulnerability. So historically, whether we are talking about the so-called global South or the so-called global North, states have instrumentalized people's everyday lives and their sexual identities to put in place documentary and disciplinary regimes. So take, for instance, the current case of pandemic politics and the polarizing debates on how digital applications, curfews, and policing mechanisms have governed our bodies and intimate lives, and how health systems and economic recovery programs have privileged some individuals and relegated others. So I feel like while the COVID-19 pandemic and the way it has been governed has restricted citizens' freedoms in general, whether we're talking about, you know, citizens in the Middle East or further afield, it has also exacerbated fault lines of inequality, leaving some people more precarious than others. So according to empirical research, LGBTQ communities were particularly impacted during the pandemic, especially in political regimes that deprived them from economic recovery programs, job opportunities, or access to health. So even in more democratic and so-called more liberal settings, as John said, pandemic politics was a fertile ground for the rise of polarizing debates on trans rights and gender identity. So also various reports have shown that LGBTQ communities were harder hit in some areas such as job loss, and they experienced increasing mental health problems. So from this perspective, I feel like it's very important to ground our book not only in the global conversation on the reversal of rights or the specific conversation about, you know, LGBTQ rights in the Middle East, but it's also very important to ground it in the broader debate on how governance systems exacerbate multiple pathways to legal, social, and economic precarity.
Well, thank you, Tamirace. Thanks, John. So, it's interesting because at some point or throughout the book, there's kind of this theme. I don't know if it's a misperception, generally speaking, that, where very often the West, etc., perceives the Middle East as mostly oppressive to LGBTQ folks. And then, we do know that's even in the preface of the book where, we do state that 5 out of 10 of the countries where homosexuality per se is punishable by death, for example, are in the Middle East. And, the theme that is also recurring, Kenneth, I felt was that, this is not a linear progression, right? This is not a linear process that has occurred over the last few decades. So before we kind of dig into the Lebanon case and why that is of particular relevance to this conversation, I was also curious about your thoughts or your views, having looked at this literature, having seen this progression over the past few decades. Because of these ebbs and flows, because it's not a linear process, where do you feel we stand as a region right now, right? When it comes to, protecting, preserving the rights of LGBTQ folks, broadly speaking, as a region. Obviously, no need to generalize there, but at least holistically, where's the trend? Where do we stand in this process?
Again, thanks, Chris. It's a really important question, which you're kind of asking about the Middle East and where it kind of stands within this kind of global kind of movement. And I think it really is important to connect what's happening in the Middle East to these broader sort of international or global currents. As I said, Hillary Clinton was talking about, the progression of LGBTQ rights, and same-sex marriage is recognized in a number of kind of states around the world. And there's often, this assumption that LGBTQ rights are kind of unfolding in this kind of linear narrative across the world. But that's just not the case. LGBTQ rights have become one of the major forms of kind of cultural wars pretty much everywhere. I live in Northern Ireland, within the UK island, and LGBTQ rights are one of the major kind of polarizing things which are kind of, occurring within the political system at the moment. And there is this kind of backlash against LGBTQ rights around the world at the moment. And it's not necessarily just to do with the fact that, societies are necessarily homophobic or have this natural inclination against homosexuality or whatever. We need to see this, I think, as part of authoritarian regimes in many places using human rights and LGBTQ populations as part of this, as a way to kind of, maintain power, to kind of blame LGBTQ populations as, kind of groups who are kind of destroying the fabric of the nation and the state and so on. So it's important not to exceptionalize, if that's a proper word, about the Middle East and just say, well, it's somehow out of key and, out of place with the rest of the world. In actual fact, it's very much part of this sort of global trend which we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, what I wanted to add is that we often look at the Middle East through the lens of, curtailed liberties. At the same time, we shouldn't also forget the fact that, LGBTQ activism has been thriving in the Middle East in the last decade. So there are so many research reports that have shown how LGBTQ activism can also thrive under repressive conditions, and how LGBTQ activists in the Middle East have been able, to invent and reinvent their tactical repertoire of strategies so as to, strike alliances, forge broader coalitions, and attract broader audiences. So I think we are also interested in this book to represent things differently, to show that the Middle East is also a vibrant site of contention where we have heterogeneous queer projects. And perhaps this is something that we will talk later more about when we allude to the Lebanese case.
Yeah, and just one thing I'd like to kind of quickly add, I'm not here to speak on behalf of LGBTQ queer activists in the Middle East because I'm not part of that community, but just in conversations, none of them have said to me, look, our end goal is same-sex marriage or abortion rights. That's not what we're about. We're not trained to import Western forms of kind of Stonewall activism into the Middle East. What we're saying is we actually just want to make sure that we're not being tortured, we're not being detained, we're not being sent to prison, we're not being kind of ostracized by our employers. So, you know, we need to understand, you know, what activists are actually kind of saying rather than just imposing this idea of what rights should be in this particular context.
No, very clear. So thank you so much for that. And we'll discuss kind of in a second this, you know, local international elements or angles as well of the tactics that I found pretty fascinating as well in a second. But maybe it is a good time, you know, based on your comments, Tamirace, to kind of zoom in a bit on Lebanon, right? Obviously, and there's kind of this other half of the book that we haven't discussed yet, which is the sectarianism part and how that fits into the puzzle in a second. But why are we? Why did you decide to write a book on Lebanon per se in that context, right? Why not Jordan? Why not Saudi Arabia? Why not Egypt, etc.? And obviously, there's this potentially selfish component where you and I are Lebanese, I guess, and this is the Lebanon program. But just broadly speaking, what makes Lebanon unique or particularly intriguing, you know, in the literature, but also in activism that has unfolded, as you mentioned, over the past decade, Tamirace?
Yeah. Okay. So the case of queer voices and queer imaginaries in Lebanon and the ways they contest the politics of sectarianism is particularly intriguing and important in various ways. And I will perhaps talk about 3 ways very briefly. Firstly, I'd like to look at the legacy of political regimes in the Middle East and situate Lebanon's political system in the broader, you know, revolts that have recently happened. So firstly, mainstream political manuals have usually depicted Lebanon's sectarian-led power-sharing system as a lesser evil amid, you know, authoritarian fortresses surrounding Lebanon, so to say. So many practitioners and international organizations have even recommended Lebanon's power-sharing system for other divided societies in the Arab world, such as Iraq, Syria, and Libya. And so when the Arab uprisings broke out in 2011, there was this prevalent story that Lebanon is different. So many argued that we do not need a revolutionary uprising as we are already far ahead, right? So also let us not forget that many international magazines, TV stations, and media outlets have always entertained this fictional belief that Beirut is a liberal and emancipated city where people can live fully their intimate and sexual lives. So yet in this book, we seek to debunk a lot of claims. We show how the sectarian logic of governance works not only by strengthening sectarian identities at the expense of individual liberties, but also by fostering a wide-ranging infrastructure, political economy, and geopolitics of control. So by producing knowledge on how Lebanon's sectarian-led power-sharing system stifles the rights of LGBTQ communities and their access to jobs, healthcare systems, and dignified living, we gain an insight really into this far-reaching logic of sectarian governance and how damaging it is. So this logic, according to me, goes beyond entrenching patriarchal and homophobic views, but it cuts to the core of the debate on welfare and social justice. We also show that the sectarian logic of governance does not only reinforce its grip through patriarchy, but through a strong geopolitical discourse. So some officials portray queer activists, you know, as destabilizing agents, traitors, and pro-Western puppets. Secondly, according to me, why our case is important is because prevalent debates on democratization and governance in Lebanon usually take an elite-based approach. They look also at sectarian communities as being the core units of governance, or debate change in Lebanon through the lens of elections or constitutional rules, you know, according to political transitions. This is all great and this is all important, yet we take a different approach in this book. We show that LGBTQ communities are key democratizing actors, challengers, and protagonists in Lebanon. Our key findings actually show that the queer politics of claims making in Lebanon transcends identity politics. Rather, queer movements position their struggle at the core of the debate of what is accountable governance. So their scripts of activism, according to our field of research, touch on health reforms, waste management reforms, environmental reforms, and banking systems reforms. In this regard, I feel like their queer projects have many insights to convey at this particular moment in time on how we can envision a new Lebanon after the overlapping crises we are currently experiencing. And my third point, and very briefly, and then I'll leave it to you, John. Most importantly, by narrating how queer voices challenge Lebanon's power sharing system, we shed light on, how complex queer struggles articulate themselves in a broader sense. So some of the questions we seek to answer in this book are, what strategic capacity do queer communities have to change things when the political environment is closed? Are they only outside challengers who can rarely obtain legal and policy concessions from the elites? Or are they able to change the status quo through cognitive and cultural legacies, or by weaving, solidarities with feminist, migrant, and environmental initiatives? So we seek more broadly, I feel, to contribute to the literature that positions queer movements as iconic actors in social movement theory, while at the same time, attracting attention to the complexity of their struggles in various political environments. And I feel that this resonates with queer struggles in various political contexts, whether we're talking about Morocco, Egypt, Poland, the US, or Mexico. It is in this sense that I feel like the book most likely resonates with a wide readership, but also with all Lebanese citizens, especially at this time, where many are pushed into poverty, and we all become united in our vulnerability.
Tough to top that, John, but I'll let you try maybe.
No, that was kind of fantastic. Yeah, what a start, Tamirace is. As you probably noticed, I'm not Lebanese. I'm in Ireland. I'm in Northern Ireland more specifically, a place. Like Lebanon is often kind of classified as a divided society, divided by ethno-national groups competing over kind of power and resources, with a legacy of conflict and sectarian power sharing systems. So I've always been interested in these issues, but I'm also a social movement scholar and kind of activist, and especially kind of interested in how social movements organize and mobilize within the context of kind of power sharing systems. So I guess, what's really interesting about the Lebanese case study is the activist movement itself. The activist movement in Lebanon is probably the first queer activist movement in the Middle East. It formed around about 2004. So it's been in operation for nearly kind of 20 years. And it's an incredibly fascinating kind of story about how the movement emerged and how it kind of situated itself within Lebanese anti-sectarian politics. It's a movement which very quickly built alliances with a whole range of kind of actors in kind of post-war Lebanon, not just feminists, but people fighting for rights for kind of Palestinians, for refugees, domestic workers. One of the really interesting kind of facts about the movement was it was a key part of the 2006 kind of work during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and even kind of Hezbollah at the time recognized LGBTQ activists for its work during the 2006 war. All of these kind of stories have been kind of obscured to some extent. So it's been really kind of fascinating to bring that to light. So, I mean, it's an amazing story about kind of the activism itself and what it's achieved within the context of a post-war kind of power sharing system. And, I think kind of secondly is the movement has attracted a lot of attention by international actors who see the Lebanese activist movement to some extent as a kind of poster child. So we want to kind of support and kind of fund the movement, but it doesn't always necessarily, from my understanding, do what's right for kind of activists. International actors want kind of quick, big wins in Lebanon. They want to see, the end of criminalization for whatever, which is not necessarily what activists are kind of talking about at the moment. So, that's a really kind of, key part of the story. And then thirdly, as I say, I work in power sharing, and, all of the emphasis in terms of kind of research and kind of power sharing is its impact on, sectarian divisions, where it institutionalizes exacerbates sectarianism. You know, a lot of research is out there about how dysfunctional these institutions are, which is really kind of important. But I think what's been obscured within this research is how kind of power sharing negatively impacts kind of range of groups who aren't officially kind of included. So it could be, you know, its impact on women's rights, gender equality, the rights of kind of migrants. But as we kind of highlight in our book, its impact on kind of queer lives, you know, it's not just for facts that kind of queer lives kind of marginalize kind of power sharing, but, you know, we could actually argue that it has real sort of negative impacts on queer lives. And that's why the activist movement has always been part of this broader sort of anti-sectarian struggle.
Yeah, no, that's very, very helpful kind of to kind of, you know, dig a bit deeper into that aspect, right? In these, I mean, we're talking about the case of Lebanon, but I think there are sometimes some similarities with kind of these post-war societies, sectarian society or sectarian political systems, etc. So how do you see, and this is kind of a good way to bring all this, what we've been discussing for the past 20 minutes and kind of build on that when it comes to tactics, etc. But before that, if you were kind of to leave people or to leave, you know, audiences with a few key themes, right, in terms of how is it that, you know, sectarianism and sexuality kind of interact and intersect. There is this intersectional approach that Tamirace discussed earlier on. Obviously, you know, queer activists don't operate in a vacuum. They are part of a society that's, you know, relatively complex when it comes to socioeconomic status, gender, sex, citizenship, nationality as well, obviously in a place like Lebanon. So how do you kind of bring these two elements together in a way, the sexuality component, but also the sectarianism component? How do they interact? You know, where do they clash particularly? And kind of bearing in mind that this could be a good transition to start at least or set the stage towards the Lebanese context, the day-to-day lives, because one of the things that I think are incredible about this book is that it's not only bringing kind of these aspects of the literature and an understanding, broadly speaking, of you know, queer struggle over decades, but also it brings it with so many, you know, personal stories, personal narratives, anecdotes. I think it was dozens, right, 70 plus kind of interactions with activists, with people within the LGBTQ community, etc. So kind of an open-ended question, but also curious about, you know, the big themes that you found fascinating and intriguing in terms of how these worlds collide potentially, or how you know, queer activism kind of tries to break down or, you know, take on the notoriously sectarian Lebanese regime.
So thanks for this question. So we are mostly interested in the research puzzle of why sectarianism per se is important for queer activism, and why sectarian politics represents a huge challenge for queer activism at the same time, and what anti-sectarianism means for the queer movement in Lebanon. So just want to walk you through some of our key findings. It emerges from our key findings in the book that changing laws and practices affecting intimate and sexual lives is not only about revoking Article 534 or changing the formal and institutional aspects of the system, whether we are talking about the electoral system, the parliament, or Lebanon's multi-sectarian executive coalition. Rather, what's fascinating is that anti-sectarianism, through the lens of queer imaginaries, is a daily act of resistance and contestation. So it's about undoing the everyday practices of the sectarian state. It's about wrestling on a daily basis with administrative bureaucracies. It's also about debunking how the state reproduces its logic of governance through formal but also informal ways, explicit and implicit ways, through clientelist networks, exploitative elite deals, or simply through subtle discriminatory employment laws as to who gets to apply and land a certain job, who gets to buy property in a certain area, who gets to access an opulent bar in Beirut or restaurant. So it's this, you know, ongoing act of insurgency and questioning that we are really interested in. So from this perspective, also understanding how queer struggles are nested within the sectarian landscape may give us also a broader insight into the struggles that anti-sectarian movements face in general, not only in Lebanon, but perhaps in Iraq and in other divided contexts. Some of these challenges are how to really transcend on the ground sectarianism. So should anti-sectarian actors coalesce with the political elite to bring about change? This is, like a concern of the many activists we interviewed. Should they try to change the political system from within? Or should they avoid collusion with existing political parties? And is it about legal, cultural, or linguistic activism? And are there ideal strategies and tactics of activism that work to overthrow the sectarian system? Also, another puzzle or another quandary is that, as protest actors, how do queer movements mobilize? How do they position themselves? Should they go visible or not? And Lebanon provides an amazing example. Is it beneficial to talk about their own grievances, or would this weaken the protests? And those were, key dividing lines along the 2019 Thawra protest sites. Alternatively, should they rather immerse their grievances within broader claims? Should they talk about power outages, capital controls, or bring up the issue of gay marriage, for instance? So activists told us, on the one hand, that mobilizing within a broader protest site dilutes their claims, and this might, in a way, weaken their activism. On the other, they told us about the many concessions that they do, when they adopt the general grievances of all Lebanese citizens. They preempt politicians' arguments that they are seeking to hijack the protest site. So their politics of activism is also a politics of, negotiation, bargaining with existing disparities of power, existing power differentials. So I felt like their dilemmas in organizing gives us powerful insights into the difficulties, but also the opportunities when it comes to mobilizing against sectarian systems in general, not only specifically in Lebanon. And this is why also looking at the issue of intersectional and alternative solidarities that anti-sectarian forces craft to weaken the regime could be particularly powerful in order to extrapolate some wider lessons as to how, transcending sectarianism works.
Thanks, Tamirace. And John, I'm curious as well about your thoughts on that. And let me add in kind of this, because this is also a recurring theme throughout the book that I find fascinating, right? This notion of visibility and invisibility, this notion of core versus the periphery, and kind of how, it's not really a binary thing, right? So curious about, anything you'd like to add, but also your take on these seemingly binary, but wrongly so, right? Wrong, they are sometimes perceived as so, but curious about this core periphery versus, as well as this visibility and visibility kind of debate.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think the relationship between sectarianism and sexuality is a really important one to look at, and there's been some really fantastic scholarship in this area, which Tamirace and I definitely draw upon to give framework for the book. However, I think what I would add here is, Lebanon is a place which has a long legacy of kind of violence. I mean, of course, that's not the only kind of characteristic of Lebanon, but it underwent a civil war between 1975 and 1990. It wasn't a sectarian conflict by any means. It had many different phases, hundreds of different actors, external, foreign intervention, and the rest of it. But basically this civil war witnessed the emergence of these sectarian warlords who were able to kind of carve out, their own sort of fiefdoms. And unfortunately, in the kind of post-war era, and especially within the context of power sharing, these warlord elites were able to kind of reimagine themselves as political leaders and leaders of sectarian communities. And, basically, what we know from kind of research in civil war and interstate conflict these days is that it's civilians who often kind of bear the brunt of kind of violence. And there's lots of kind of stories now coming out about how LGBTQ queer populations are actually kind of targeted during civil war. There's so many kind of examples from kind of Colombia, Northern Ireland, Peru, Iraq, Syria. So kind of LGBTQ populations are targeted. It's these warlords who are often kind of responsible for it. So it's not a surprise that once these warlords, are given seats and lots of kind of political power, they bring into the post-war society these kind of homophobic attitudes. And, it's kind of evidence of this. I'm not going to mention names, but leading Lebanese lawmaker who was a renowned warlord. About a year ago, went to Geneva with a Lebanese delegation of lawmakers and voted down a bill to recognize global LGBTQ rights. So there's this kind of legacy from the conflict itself, which is brought into the kind of peace process. So that's kind of one way in which we can understand this kind of relationship. I think kind of secondly, kind of power sharing sectarian systems by their nature only recognize the main sectarian or ethnic groups and give power to them. So what it does, it kind of obscures other issues, whether it's gender equality, whether it's labor rights, whether it's for rights for kind of migrants and refugees and so on. All of these kind of things are completely obscured. So basically what happens here is there's no institutional kind of access for these groups who aren't institutionally classified as part of a system. So, for kind of LGBTQ populations, how do they kind of gain rights within the system? And that's kind of one of the main kind of puzzles we've been looking at, is how do kind of activist groups who are both kind of criminalized and have no institutional kind of access into the system mobilize to kind of gain rights? But yeah, I mean, as I say, there's been some really important kind of research on this, which is looking at the relationship between sectarianism and sexuality. And there's a really nice kind of term, sectarianism, which kind of captures this relationship between sort of sectarian power sharing systems and sexuality. The fact is that sectarian power sharing systems have very important kind of effects on queer people. And what we're trying to do in terms of our book is look to see how these movements can try to affect change within a context which is very inhospitable for them institutionally.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
No problem.
Yeah,
did you want me to kind of talk about visibility or invisibility, or we can maybe bring that up later if you want?
Whatever you want. Yeah, sure. Maybe explaining the concept, because I think it's incredibly powerful and interesting, at least in the Lebanese context, but broadly speaking as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess kind of visibility is at the core of kind of Western, what we call kind of Stonewall activism, which emerged, in the US in the 1960s. The idea, Harvey Milk famously said, come out, and be proud, and only through that we're going to create change. So, the idea of visibility is that people come out, admit their sexuality. This will then, recruit other people to the movement. It makes the wider kind of population aware of kind of sexual diversity, and supposedly it become more tolerant of kind of sexual diversity. Visibility is also about, being visible within media, TV, movies. It's about kind of pride parades. So that's kind of Western kind of activism. And to some extent, it's been really successful, in the Western sort of context, when we think about how rights have been achieved. And there's lots of really convincing research that shows that, the more we're aware of kind of sexual diversity, the more likely we are to be kind of tolerant. But nevertheless, this idea of visibility doesn't always kind of translate well to other contexts, especially in a context where queer populations are criminalized and subjected to harassment, torture, and being sent to prison. So the problem here is, the more visible you become, the danger is there's going to be a backlash. And we've certainly seen this in Lebanon. When activists kind of take to the streets, when they've organized pride events, we've seen very quickly the various arms of security apparatus kind of clamp down on activists, including sending them to kind of prison. This occurred in relationship to the Beirut Pride celebrations a few years ago. So, I think what activists are trying to do is negotiate this idea of visibility. You don't have to be visible all of the time. You can be invisible, you can be kind of mobilized and behind the scenes, you can be working through kind of non-formal institutions. How do you kind of build a relationship with judiciary, with, the police and security forces? It's not just about going into the streets and protesting. It's actually about sort of building sometimes kind of informal relationships with these kind of, different kind of apparatuses to affect kind of change. I mean, to some extent, visibility has been used by activists. Like a really good example of this is there was a Lebanese TV show, like a current affairs show about 10 years ago. And the news reporter went to an adult cinema in Beirut, and he went there undercover, and he reported on the people in the cinema and said that security forces should immediately come down and arrest everybody in the cinema. And that's basically what happened a few days later. So all of the people in the cinema were arrested and subjected to really horrible kind of torture. And there's actually like a major kind of backlash against this by the Lebanese kind of population, and said, actually, this is really kind of horrible and disgusting. And, you know, what Lebanese activists were able to do was use their kind of influence within some of these media organizations to say, look, actually, why not provide a much more kind of positive representation of queer people? Why not actually invite us onto kind of TV shows so we can actually present our own case about what we're trying to do? So, I mean, they've been very successful in that sense. It's more problematic, however, if we're talking about, you know, the representation of trans people in the media. That's still quite kind of problematic. Trans people are often kind of represented as kind of caricatures and figures of fun and so on. So this kind of visibility is, you know, not based, I don't think, on the classic Western form of kind of visibility, coming out, you know, going into the streets and so on. It's a more of a negotiated terms of visibility to kind of understand where it works, where it doesn't work, where working behind the scenes is more successful than, you know, antagonizing the security forces.
Yeah, thanks, Don, for that. And I think, you know, there's a lot of examples and testimonies and et cetera on like some of these instances in situation of the legal judiciary system, or, you know, dealing with police, or even with doctors, the medical professionals, et cetera, which kind of illustrates all of this. And by the way, you didn't name it, but the politician who did vote this down in Geneva was Nabih Berri, just if people are wondering. And that, not that the others
my mouth is shut.
Yeah, not that any other, that others are like angels anyway on that matter. But let me maybe transition to you also, Tamirace, because this is kind of one of these incredibly interesting aspects of the book, right, where you discuss tactics, strategies, organizational challenges, etc., as well as the different types of activism, really, that activists, queer, LGBTQ, etc., use, you know, in the Lebanese context, be it advocacy, politics, you know, we discuss underground, horizontal activism, etc. So very curious as well if you can comment on this, on any interesting, appealing, revealing kind of tactics and strategies that have been deployed as part of this broader multi-year struggle.
Yes, of course, this is a fascinating question. So I will talk briefly about the multidimensional tactical repertoires that queer activists use to mobilize, and about their modes of organizing. So perhaps the sentence that one of the activists told us sums it all up: we have always been there. So perhaps when we adopt a linear sense of temporality to understand when and under what circumstances queer movements in Lebanon become active or dormant, this is not really helpful. Rather, one key takeaway of our field research is that we need to retrace the multi-layered field of informal alliances that goes back to years of coalition building and networks. So during the 2019 Thawra, for instance, many journalists and reporters talked about a sudden upsurge in queer activism in Lebanon. So yet this is not what our field research shows. In fact, as many of our interviewees tell us, we need to account for precursory and informalized organizing, or what Asif Bayat frames as the subterranean aspects of activism. So it emerges from our interviews with activists that the informality of the struggle, as well as the various coalitions they have built throughout the years with anti-racist, migrant, and feminist coalitions, are crucial. So take, for instance, the post-2011 Arab uprising scene. So this period, according to some of our interviewees, has been a determining juncture for their activism. So I'm going to give some examples. During this period, a transnational mode of organizing gained ground. So Lebanese queer activists learned a lot from the Arab uprisings, and they started increasingly reaching out and working together with Iraqi, Palestinian, and Syrian queer activists. Also, in the wake of displacement from Syria, queer activists in Lebanon started co-organizing with refugee-centric initiatives. And this is very powerful. So the issue of displacement brought coalitions rallying for refugees LGBTQ, and gender rights. So we see here that there is a continuum of activism, right, rather than a monolithic lens of looking at queer activism in Lebanon. So from this perspective, it's very important to stress that queer activism in Lebanon has never been a self-contained project. It cuts across grievances, and it is rooted in longer temporalities, longer cycles of protests. So during some episodes of contention, such as the anti-sectarian protests in 2011, or the 2015 Hirak during the waste management crisis, queer activists were very successful in forging alliances with other groups. What they did is that they didn't necessarily, bring in their specific grievances onto the protests. Rather, they felt that such moments of contention provide them with discursive and political opportunities to talk about social justice. So during these moments of contention, they portrayed homophobia, patriarchy, and hegemony as, tightly interlinked with inept and unaccountable governance. For instance, during the 2015 Youth Think movement, the Hirak, or the 2019 Thawra, they linked hegemonic patriarchy to the broader discourse on environmental, social, and economic justice. And I feel like this intersectionality is particularly insightful in gaining an insight into the manifold ways that queer activism in Lebanon manifests itself. Most importantly, we tried in the book in chapter 5 to come up with what we call a typology of queer activism in post-war Lebanon. We have shown that queer initiatives are varied and that they cannot be understood through a monolithic lens. Some activists seek legal visibility. They try to carry out advocacy work, and they think that this is very important. They advocate for repealing Article 534, for decriminalizing homosexuality. Others are interested in providing services and emergency assistance, as well as creating safe spaces for the LGBTQ community. Still, there are also everyday modes of activism, such as organizing storytelling nights. Additionally, our field research shows that underground activism is extremely important. Drawing on art, literature, storytelling, as I said, or depicting activism as a form of uninstitutionalized and everyday resistance is at the very heart of the tactical repertoire that some initiatives adopt. So these types of activism, and this is very important to highlight, are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they intersect and borrow from each other. For instance, an organization or initiative such as Hilm may choose to integrate several forms of activism in its menu of action. It might also shift these forms of activism in accordance with the political opportunity. So we attract attention to the fact that strategies of activism that queer activists use are very much context-driven. And this resonates for me with a wider research on protests, showing that activists do not simply emulate or parachute, strategies, but produce strategies that are very much in line with the context they are in. For instance, and here I'm alluding to the French Revolution, if we think about the strategy of the barricade. So the strategy of the barricade was born of the everyday disputes that contending powers were faced with. And so, when we were doing field research during the 2019 Thawra, I was also very intrigued in the ways queer activists negotiated their forms of activism on an everyday basis. When do they engage into roadblocks? When do they go for sit-ins in front of financial and political institutions? When do they use underground tactics, such as meeting in safe spaces to talk and strategize together? So, the modes of activism are not monolithic. They are rather rooted in shifting logics. So, for instance, if you recall in 2019, in October and November 2019, queer activists left graffiti everywhere in Beirut as physical marks of their presence. At the same time, what is paradoxical is that they met in semi-secret places, and they hardly occupied physical spaces or erected tents in central Beirut. So what does this tell us about their forms of strategizing and mobilizing? So from this perspective, it's very important to acknowledge that their strategies of activism vary, they're not monolithic, and they also operate in a continuum, of different shades between visibility and invisibility.
Thanks, Tamirace. I was going to ask you as well if you want to add something to that in a second, but I just want to encourage the audiences I just realized time flies in these setups, so we have 10 minutes left, but if people in the audience would like to also ask questions, you can definitely use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screens. And yeah, let me turn to you, maybe John, and as we start to kind of converge towards closing, there's a billion topics I wanted to discuss, but obviously no space, but curious about potentially discussing about a bit because there's a lot of obviously attention, I think well-intended, sometimes, often well-intended when it comes to international observers, international human rights, international NGOs. And, this is a DC think tank, and, obviously people care about these things in such context when they approach it. There's the issue of funding, sometimes an issue of international policy, etc. So I was curious about your thoughts on how these things typically happen, any caveats that are often associated with what we call, or what you label throughout the book as the global north approach to the Lebanese case per se. So anything there we should be paying attention to in particular?
Yeah, great question, Chris. So as I mentioned earlier, because the movement in Lebanon was pretty much the first queer movement in the Middle East, emerged around kind of 2004, 2005. For that reason, global north actors, whether it's kind of embassies, diplomatic institutions or whatever, human rights kind of actors and organizations have, looked at Lebanon and thought, well, how can we kind of support the LGBTQ movement as part of this kind of cascading of rights across the MENA region? So I think the assumption is, yeah, if it works in Lebanon, then therefore we can use this as a kind of template for disseminating rights in other places around the world. But, there's a kind of problem of just kind of misunderstanding what the activist movement is about, and it's kind of really easy to do. And, kind of part of the problem is you have these international actors who want, on the whole, really kind of quick and big wins. So to give you an example here, I know, for example, the US, in terms of its diplomatic mission in Lebanon, really wanted to put out a big signal about success in Lebanon, and that was to end the criminalization of queer populations. So queer populations in Lebanon are criminalized under Article 534, which criminalizes so-called sex against the order of nature. And, you can see why they want to do this, because they think, once we kind of overturn this, then this will kind of lead to greater rights for, Lebanese queer populations and then queer populations elsewhere. And, there's a lot of kind of pressure, I think, from the US and other kind of diplomatic missions in Lebanon on activists to be kind of focusing on this. And, I was kind of talking to some activists and kind of human rights lawyers in Lebanon, so they're saying, like, it's impossible, it just won't happen. You can't kind of put pressure on policymakers in Lebanon. And even if, activists wanted to work through the kind of power sharing sectarian institutions, it just won't work. It's such a kind of Byzantine sort of system. So, for activists, if they wanted to put forward, a bill to overturn same-sex criminalization of same-sex relations in Lebanon, it would go to, first of all, the Speaker of the House, who you mentioned is Nabi Berri, who, a couple of years ago went to Geneva to vote against LGBTQ rights. And that's just the first step. And then it has to go through all of these kind of committees before it even gets to the kind of parliament. So it's impossible. And, the more that kind of activists start talking about, ending criminalization, publicly announce in their declaration to do this, then of course, this is going to lead to a greater chance of kind of backlash, because then of course, the political elites and the security forces can use this as a pretense to kind of clamp down on the population. So I think, there's a sort of misunderstanding of what activists are actually trying to achieve, what they want. And, global north actors have their own sort of, kind of logics, policy demands and whatever, which are very kind of short-termist, kind of guided by, whatever, and it doesn't necessarily kind of translate well to these kind of contexts. So, of course, what we would emphasize is that these kind of actors speak to activists in a broad sense, that the activist movement is not this kind of coherent, homogenous block of kind of people. It's actually very varied with many kind of different sort of political ideologies and whatever. And I think what happens sometimes with the Global North is they select one or two highly visible sort of activists who kind of fit into the mold of what the Global North wants to kind of see in Lebanon. And they kind of ignore and eschew all of the other kind of type of activists who are out there. I mean, not to kind of, kind of finally, I would say, not to be sort of too negative about, Global North actors. I know, for example, within one embassy over the last few years, the European embassy, there was one kind of high profile figure who started actually reaching out to kind of activists, bringing different embassy workers to kind of meet activists, once a month, whether it was just through a meal or, just meeting at a club or whatever, and just actually kind of talking through what people are actually trying to kind of achieve, what other kind of strategies, and how the Global North can actually support these activists. Because, the more the Global North kind of talks about what we're trying to do, the more that, Lebanese politicians, elites can actually say, look, this actually demonstrates that the West is trying to impose sexual imperialism into Lebanon. It's a foreign vice and we should resist it at all kind of terms. So in actual fact, the Global North, in many ways, is better off, being invisible, sort of working behind the scenes as much as possible.
Thank you, Tamirace. Any additional thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, perhaps
question after that. Yeah.
Perhaps just some highlights from our field research. What do activists think about, Global North funding? So some activists were concerned, for instance, about whether donor agendas are attuned to their local struggles and modes of activism. So some talked, for instance, about scripts of activism that are prescribed, and they felt like, the script of activism, which revolves around sit-ins, advocacy, lobbying, and legal activism, does not really capture Lebanon's local contexts, right? Because we talk about underground activism more and about this ambiguously visible queer politics. So it can be a conceptual mismatch to the heterogeneous queer projects that, activists have in mind, as Lara Bitar says, for instance. So another concern was that in the last years, as you know, there has been this proliferation of what we call the localization of the Sustainable Development Goals and this agenda, or the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So many activists told us that they were all the time invited, but while they felt that, they were at the table, they never felt that they had a stake in how policy processes are shaped. So it's also about this, notion of being always a policy recipient rather than a policy shaper. And last but not least, some highlighted at times that following donor scripts, in a way turns them into service providers. And this is something that they wanted to avoid. And also because when we talk about fragmented politics in Lebanon, we cannot but talk about NGOization and about the further fragmentation and temporality of aid that John alluded to. So one last thing, according to some interviewees, they really highlighted that they felt more comfortable with donors who gave them more freedom in designing their projects, setting their own theory of change, and also setting their own objectives. So empowerment, really, it's not about prescribing scripts, as John said. So it's important, I feel like, one last thing to say, that it is important to acknowledge heterogeneous queer projects and, to talk about empowerment by letting, activists take and craft their own ownership rather than having, scripts of activism dictated upon them.
Thank you, Tamirace. This is incredibly helpful as well. And I want to end with a 30-second question to each of you, where at the beginning of the book you talk about how queer feminism, feminist activism, etc., in Lebanon are, it's comparable in a way to a snakes and ladders kind of setup where it's non-linear by default, etc. So if you were to think of the biggest snakes and the biggest ladders in a way that are facing the the activists you've talked to over the past few years, what would that be in a way? I don't know if Don, you want to go first, and then we'll end with Tamirace.
Yeah, it's a really big question. There's, especially in Lebanon, it's kind of triage kind of things which have happened over the last kind of few years. First of all, the kind of pandemic, which has, affected all of us. Then secondly, of course, the explosion, which occurred at the port, and killed hundreds of kind of people. And kind of thirdly, Lebanon's going through this exceptional sort of economic kind of paralysis, which World Bank has, I think, said is amongst the third worst anywhere internationally over the last 150 years. People's wages have been eviscerated. We're seeing kind of hyperinflation. So there's all these kind of issues which are impacting on Lebanon very kind of broadly. And of course, the LGBTQ people, kind of queer population are one of, the kind of groups who are kind of particularly kind of affected by these kind of dynamics. But I think I'll let kind of Tamirace kind of step in at this point.
Yeah, thanks, John. So to be very concise and precise about the manifold challenges that lie ahead, perhaps I would like to talk about some concrete challenges that are happening right now. So local activists are concerned about the fact that with Lebanon's economic crisis, queer activist spaces are fading out. So they are concerned about the shrinking of, safe spaces, communal spaces, and about the implications of Lebanon's economic crisis for the existence of the spaces where they could meet and strategize. So as you know, many places have closed down in Beirut. Some of the places where they used to meet, have closed down. So these places are shrinking, almost disappearing. And also these places are becoming increasingly at the mercy of private donors or political party initiatives. So here it's very important to factor in the fact that economic deprivation and poverty would only strengthen the sectarian state and would reverse the many gains that LGBTQ activists have made. It would also consolidate the far-reaching grip of sectarian political parties that now are branding themselves as the saviors, the problem solvers, the poverty alleviators. So if I were to leave the audience with just one recommendation, I feel like for external donors or researchers who are interested in this problem in Lebanon, I feel like this is really, a crucial time to carry out evidence-based research about how Lebanon's economic crisis and overlapping disasters, are particularly affecting queer individuals when it comes to job opportunities, mental health issues, and ability to access health and livelihoods. We need indeed, stronger knowledge and evidence as to how the resurgence of the sectarian, system and the overlapping crises are further, shrinking and in a way dilapidating and dissipating the many gains that LGBTQ activists have so far made.
Tamirace, John, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Thank you for this amazing piece of scholarly work, but also thank you for documenting and sharing with the rest of us effectively some of these voices, some of these activist concerns and opportunities that are facing the queer and the feminist movements in Lebanon today. Thank you to the audiences as well. The link is again in the chat. I couldn't wait to get my physical copy, so I did purchase the digital copy, which is also an option. But John, Tamirace, thanks again. Thanks to the audiences, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting us.
Many thanks. Yeah, great.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.